For my second talk, I chose to do forestry ruled under Mao. China is one of the most anthropogenically altered landscapes in pre-modern times, with environmental degradation able to be traced back for an entire millennium. China has always viewed population growth central to national security, tax pay, and for their army, also creating recurrent food insecurity throughout times. Much of China's countryside has been altered to accommodate growing agriculture, with that much of the forest have been cut down for timber, construction, and fuel. During 2 millennia of China's imperial history, the country had lost 300 million hectares of forest, half being arguably unavoidable due to conversion into farms, settlements, and transport networks. Under Mao and the People's Republic of China, there was push for intensive resource exploitation, for economic development to reconstruct the impoverished nation. High demand with limited supply and no limitations left overcutting, shortages and wastage as a result. There was a large reform taking place, reconstructing land ownership and wealth distribution. Private-owned forests from the wealthy were confiscated and redistributed. 42% of forests were nationalized, leaving the state with 68% of control of the timber volume produced annually. Private ownership was effectively dismantled in 1956. Cooperative living and communes were initiated, but were soon overwhelmed to keep up with productive forest management, making mass deforestation that made a sharp decline in forest cover between 1957 and 1964. First National Forestry Conference was held in 1955 with the plan to reforest 100 million hectares on barren lands and mountains within a decade. Unfortunately, tree seeds were chosen out of availability instead of soil, environment, and provenance measures. Monitoring only included the planting and not the growth of the species, so less than 30% of the trees survived. The Chinese Academy of Forestry was commenced in 1958, the same year that afforestation efforts ended with the Great Leap Forward, and were not reinitiated until 1979 with the Reform era. Mao initiated the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1961. Many industrialization projects followed, and deforestation, erosion, and degradation of environment was immense. By 1980, an estimated 3,000 dams that had been built during the Great Leap had completely collapsed. This showed the futility of intense environmental degradation. Because of China's low coal supply in certain regions, mass deforestation took place to fuel furnaces producing iron and steel. This was an effort to try and keep up with the steel production taking place in Great Britain. This caused immense climate change, which would go on to affect weather conditions, introducing large locust swarms, and was backed by a flawed system of taxation and exporting goods. This is what pushed China into the worst famine of the 20th century. This all took place because food security took precedence over the benefit and importance of forest ecology. There were great big cutting areas of the forest in 1966 all the way till 1976. Forests were cut all on slopes to be replaced by crops. This led to great erosion with winds turning it into desert land. Because of this mentality is what made these famines. That self-reliance was key and that every state should be self-reliant and be able to feed themselves. Under Mao's rule, the state ordered 200,000 Han Chinese to grow rubber trees in southern Jingchuanbana, a biodiversity hotspot with more than 12 ethnic minorities. The traditional forest practices in this area would have been growing and cutting rotations of 13 years. However, these were overlooked to make clear cuts and make room for rubber trees. The forest in this area went from 70% forestation in the 1940s to only 26% of having forest coverage by the end of Mao's rule. 3 decades prior to the 1978 economic reforms, China's forest sector had no clear legislation to regulate operations and output. supplying deliberately underpriced logs to sustain national economic development. 24% of China's total forested areas were lost during the Cultural Revolution that took place between 1966 and 1976. 104 million hectares of reseeded forests yielded only success rates of about 20%. This was due to careless planting, lack of scientific approach, and inadequate long-term care. Land in China is either collectively owned or state-owned. Forest resources therefore belong either to the state or are managed by the state, owned by forest enterprises, or to a collective. This is one of the many examples that go to show how difficult it is to control all aspects, resources, and people within one country without making any errors. Mao Zedong was without a doubt a powerful revolutionary, but this did not take away from him also being an incredibly powerful tyrant. Thank you.